Welcome back to the Good, the Bad and the Ugly podcast with me, Tony Murrell. This week's special guest is someone whose work has shaken the foundations of British institutions. Investigative journalist and former detective Mark Williams-Thomas, best known for exposing Jimmy Savile and uncovering shocking truths others were too afraid to touch. This episode dives into some of the darkest corners of society and the light it takes to reveal them. Thanks for listening and watching this episode.
Since Savile, I have not presented a programme for the BBC, and I'm sure it's coincidental. Whether it be Oscar, whether it be Jill Dando, whether it be Madeleine McCann, Jay Slater, there's not many stories that caused the Director General of the BBC to resign.
Welcome to the Good, the Bad and the Ugly podcast with me, Tony Murrell, and this week's special guest is Mark Williams-Thomas. Really looking forward to sharing the Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Mark, how are we?
Yeah, nice to meet you, Tony.
Thank you very much for coming all this way. I know you've had a bit of a journey, but listen, thank you so much for giving your time up, and we've been wanting to get you on for a long time. You're a very interesting gentleman, and I just thought I'd love to have this.
I think it's about 18 months. It's
18
been a
months.
long time. It's been a long time.
But it's great because, you've honoured it and said, Tony, look, I'm very busy, and it's great that you give your time up. You come up with your lovely partner and stuff, so thank you very much for giving your time up and stuff. So, Mark, your career, as a police officer and stuff, a criminologist, investigative journalist, you've had quite, some life sort of thing, so to speak. But some of the high case profiles you've been involved in, Jimmy Savile, Jill Dando, Madeleine McCann, many, many more cases. We're going to delve into that, and there's a couple of questions we've asked our followers to get involved with, and they've sent us some questions in which you gladly, you've had a little look and you're quite happy to answer. So listen, I just want to start from where you're from, where you grew up, family life and school life was like.
So I grew up in Solihull. I went to school, Eversfield School in Solihull. Stayed there until I was probably about, 9 or 10, then moved up to Surrey. Because my brother was very dyslexic. I'm a bit dyslexic, but my brother's very dyslexic. So we moved up, and at the time there was a dyslexic centre called the Helen Arkell Dyslexic Centre in Farnham. It was the only one around. So my brother went there, I came up, went to school up here, and kind of stayed in Surrey till I then went and joined the police. And when I was at school, I finished at school, finished as school captain at school, and I loved my time there. It was really kind of an opportunity really to I think you find yourself kind of around that age, 17, 18, and I was just sports mad, absolutely sports mad, just played rugby all the time. Any opportunity to play rugby, and I played rugby at a very high level, and I loved it. I really loved it. And then I thought, do you know what? I'm never going to be able to sit behind a desk. That's just not me. And I needed a vocation in life as well. And I thought, do you know what? Why not become a police officer? So the way in those days to kind of be a police officer was become a special and then become a police officer. So special kind of like part-time, you get paid, it's volunteer. So I used to do that on a Friday night and once during the week. I really enjoyed it. I thought, do you know what, actually there's a bit of a buzz here. I quite enjoy this. And then so I applied to the police service to become a police officer. But at the same time, I was playing rugby at Harlequins. And I got an offer to go over to New Zealand and play for an affiliated club over there. And I thought, what a great opportunity. So I was all ready to go over to New Zealand, and I'd applied to both Surrey and Hampshire Police. And one of the forces, I can't remember which one, came back to me and said, well, you can only apply for one force. Which one do you want it to be? And I thought, okay, I'll go for Surrey. So I went for Surrey, and they gave me an interview really quickly after that. And it all felt very quick. It probably wasn't as quick as this, but it all felt very quick that they then offered me, the opportunity to become a police officer. And so I had to turn down my opportunity to go and play rugby in New Zealand, which was a real shame really, because some of the players I was playing with at the time then went on and played internationals. Yeah. So, I was playing at a good level. Joined the police service and thoroughly enjoyed it. I did in my first policing year, so in the first 18 months, I definitely was supervised. So my sergeant in those early days was a bully. There's no doubt about that. And actually I write about him in my book. I make reference to him in my book, but there's no doubt that he was a bully. But a bully in such a way that I wouldn't ever want to go through that again. And I wouldn't want anybody else to go through it. But he did teach me some things which have been quite crucial in terms of how I look at things. So I'm very specific and very clear in terms of detail. The details are really important for me. I'm very clear in terms of how things should be phrased and worded. and very particular. And I think he gave me some of those skills. I mean, I remember gone are the days when you were growing up at school and you had to learn the times table. On a Sunday morning on earlies, he'd have us in the briefing room learning definitions. Learning the definition, like for theft, to dishonestly appropriate property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving them of it. That is the definition of theft. And there's other ones I could tell you, and that's only because he had us in that kind of briefing room learning it. I hated it. I'd be on early shift, and the night before on early shift, I would be so worried. I couldn't sleep because I'd be worried the next day he would be there. And we'd have to go in there and do that, and literally made my life really, really horrible.
Was it just yourself, Mark, or was it with all of you?
No, he only picked on probationers, so there's probably like three of us, but one of them he really liked, and he was an older probationer. But no, he just picked on us, and I just happened to be on his rota. So as soon as I could get away from him, I did. But he taught me some stuff. But I think that bullying aspect in every job, unfortunately, some people face. But I did that, and then I went on and did community safety, specialised very quickly into child protection. Then went into doing major crime, murders.
The child protection, Mark, for me, I remember, and this is a true story. You've just met my daughter then and stuff, and I remember there was the child protection units. And I remember sitting my daughter down because at the time she was like, I'm sure she was going to like high school, about online predators and stuff like that. Yeah. And, and stuff like that. And I remember sitting her down and said, watch this. You need to understand about, the dangers of going online and how people work. Not everyone's your friend.
No.
And when you're a young kid and stuff like that, and I'll never forget, it's a true story that. And I remember, I said, you sit down, you watch that. And I remember getting a laptop on a shoulder. Yeah. And it was you and your team.
It was me, was it?
It was you. Mark, it's a true story. Honest to God, it's a true story. And I said, you watch this. And I'm sure you were snaring someone, like catching a predator. He was talking to someone online.
Yeah. I think it was probably, in fact, that was the first break I got in telly. So my first break in telly, I went to see ITV's Tonight programme. Used to be fronted by Trevor McDonald.
Yeah.
Tonight for ITV. It was their flagship current affairs programme, similar to Panorama for BBC. And I went to see the editor there, and I said to him, I've got this really good idea. It's a paedophile priest who's in Germany, who is talking to what he thinks is a young girl in Wales, who's 13, 14 years old, and he wants to come over and see her, take her to cinema, and obviously his intention is to have sex with her. And I said, we could do a really good sting on him. And he said, yeah, sounds brilliant. And I said, look, I'd really like to front it. And of course, I'd never fronted a programme before. And he said, listen, Mark, you're not a face on ITV. Of course you can't front it. But you could go with a reporter and you could stand by the reporter and talk about it. So I said, OK, I'll give that a go. So anyway, we fly over to Germany and the reporter is on another location, on another shoot. And we get there and we go and see the police there. And we say to the police, listen, can you help us? We need to go and speak to this person. Anyway, cut a long story short, basically they said, we don't have the resources to do it, go away. And we said, well, we're going to have to talk to him tomorrow morning because we've travelled all the way over here. So the following morning, they go and arrest him. And they go and arrest him because we're watching the house. They arrest him, take him away, bring him back at lunchtime. We're still watching the house. He goes into the house very quickly, disappears from the house, and then he gets in his car and drives away. We follow him and he goes and meets somebody in a housing estate. We don't know who this person is. So we stay on his tail, we follow him, and then we take him to the town centre, and he walks into an internet cafe in the town centre. And when he walks into the cafe, he goes straight downstairs onto a computer and he chats, because he'd been arrested, he chats to the person he thought was a young girl and says, you got me arrested, what happened? Anyway, the young girl fronted it up. It wasn't a young girl, it was a covert, fronted up and said it wasn't anything to do with me. He went, oh, okay, can I still come and see you? Anyway, the reporter wasn't there. And I said to the editor, we were on the phone to the editor, and the editor said, listen, are you up to going to confront him? Because the reporter's not there. I said, yeah, easy for me. I've done it in the police. So I go downstairs and for 30 minutes, he talks to me, tells me about his sexually interested children, tells me about how he was arrested that morning. And that was my break in telly, because the following morning, we had all the material. And the following morning, the editor said to me, there isn't any, we can't put the reporter now into it because you've already done it. And that was it.
But Mark, for that situation, how's that like speaking to like, you know, a predator, speaking to young children, you know, that's their interest. And most people, most, you know, male, female, adults, we know that's wrong. You know, one, you probably want to strangle him, or you know what I mean, and taking matters into your own hands, what a lot of people probably would do. But to sit there and speak, and just speaking, no bother about it. He thinks it's right to do that. You know, after just being arrested as well. Do you know what I mean? And he straight away.
I think one of the key things is, and it's not for everybody, you know, you've got to be in a position where you are comfortable talking to people about these things and they don't get a sense that you hate them or you find them repulsive, because if you do that, they won't talk to you.
They won't open up.
The reality is I will become anyone's friend if I feel that there's a benefit in terms of helping. So if I have to talk to someone who's viciously raped a young child or committed a murder, and they think that I have total empathy with them, I understand what would have gone on,
slowly,
and they feel like I'm a bit of a friend to them, I'll do that. The reality is, of course, I'm not, but I'm getting information from them. And in fact, everybody, you know, I can only think of one interview where I've ever been in a position where they haven't talked to me, because you know they do. You interview people in a fashion that you make them feel comfortable, and then they start to open up. I remember interviewing a guy, Anthony Bridger, who was a senior air traffic controller when I was in Surrey Police. We had allegations initially in that he'd abused, I think, 2 or 3 young boys on, they'd gone around and washed his car. So we managed to get enough evidence to go and search his address. We searched his address. We found some child abuse material, but we also found a diary, and in that diary were loads of names of young boys. And we interviewed him the following day. And during the interview, we said, look, can you tell us about the people you've abused? Anyway, he sat there and he said, I'll tell you what, if you ask me a question, I won't lie. So we then had to be very clever, because in relation to all these boys, we didn't know whether he'd abused them. We found one video of a boy, which was a really sad occasion, because we found one video of a boy. We had to meet his parents because he was a young person. We said to his parents, listen, this is really tough. Can I show you this video? Obviously it wasn't the bit that was, is this your son? And they said, yeah. And obviously we got a disclosure then, but we played a very clever game with him. And actually what we did is we put to him the names of the boys and saying, look, we know you've abused this person. We didn't, but he coughed it. He then said, yeah, okay, I did this.
He played his bluff type of thing.
Yeah. So he told us, and actually he ended up at the Old Bailey. We took him to the Old Bailey, Central Criminal Court, and he got 15 years.
You know, that's a big sentence, you know, and we think that the sentences for this type of crime, you know, I'm going to touch on it a little bit later in the episode, but 15 years back then, Mark, is a long time. It's like today's sentence, and it's failings, I think, you know what I mean, with this type of things. But we are going to get onto that. But what I want to talk about, Mark, is, you know, the documentaries you've done, like The Investigator, Catch Me If You Can and stuff. Obviously, you had your break in TV, obviously, with that, you know, going over to Germany. How have they been like putting them documentaries together? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I love crafting and creating something. So over the years, obviously, you learn in television how to make television. So when I first started out in television, I was just the face in front of a camera, you know, and you talk and you present. And the way that I do is that we have rough scripts in terms of how we deliver. And sometimes we have to do it word for word if it's a compliance issue. But generally, I just talk, you know, and I think it's about being in the moment and being able to kind of like connect with the viewer, although obviously you're not directly talking to them. But as I've gone through television, and obviously as I've made more and more programs now, and for a long time now, you know, I produce all of my programs. So I write the script for all of my programs. I do all the compliance for all of my programs, and I craft them. So I sit through the edit as well. So whilst I don't do the edit, I will sit as an edit producer with the editor and then say, right, change this, and change this. So my stamp of the program is from the beginning to the end. And the great thing is, because of every program and because obviously of what I've done, is whenever I speak to a contributor, so if I, for example, go and speak to a contributor, I can say to a contributor with confidence that, you know, whatever we find out in the program, and it will be something new because that's the way that you know, we can work, is that I can guarantee you that I will come and show you, I will tell you exactly what's in the program, and we'll talk it through. And you know, So I can give them that trust, whereas a lot of people who make television programs, they can't say to the contributor, this is exactly as it's going to be, and we'll talk it through. So for example, when I made the program with Oscar Pistorius, I said to Oscar right from the very beginning, I will come and show you the program before it goes out. I want you to see it. Not for them to turn around and say, you can't do that, you can't do that. But because I've got the confidence and the honesty in making a program, and I think we have to be, as program makers, we have to be fair, we have to be transparent, and we have to be honest. There's too many people out there who make television programs who aren't honest and straight. These are people's lives we deal with, and I think particularly when we make programs about cases that are unsolved or perhaps even solved, we have to bear in mind the impact and the trauma, not just on the direct family, but on the removed and the wider family as well. Because it's all well and good saying, well, okay, that happened 10 years ago. But for a family who've lost a loved one or haven't resolved the issue,
still raw,
it's still raw.
Do you know what, Mark? Like you're saying there, it's building that trust up, and because what you've been in this gig, doing like say producing and editing and stuff like that. There's people that can edit it and make certain people look.
Oh yeah.
Do you get what I mean? Where,
totally.
Like we've just been said before, look, we'll send you this and send you that, because you're playing with people's lives. If you're bringing a case up which is maybe not unsolved, it's unsolved, or it's still raw, and or the person's still out there, they've not been caught. And when you're putting a program out there which is watched by millions and when it's going on national television.
Yeah.
It's not just, or even on the internet.
But I think if you take the scenarios of how television programs are made, so I know lots of people have got real hang-ups on the way that the main broadcasters work. So for example, BBC and ITV, but they've got very strong compliance issues, and there's very strong guidance around that through Ofcom, through in the way that television programs are made. Whereas some of the platforms, Amazon, Netflix, Paramount, they don't have those safety elements around it. So for example, you look at some of the Netflix programs that are out there, some of them would never make it onto British television because they just haven't been done properly. So for example, the Life and Death of Robert Durst, which is an incredible program about a multimillionaire who commits, I think it's 3 murders, and in essence gets away with these 3 murders. It's astonishing. But he then reveals something in a tape, in a recording, when he thought the mic was off. But the way that program is edited is there's edited sequences out of order, and actually, as a result of that, it caused some real problems for the FBI when they wanted to investigate it. Now, we couldn't do that, and I wouldn't do that. I have a real ethical issue in terms of when I make programs, is that we have to be honest and straight. If somebody tells me something, we need to make sure that it's in the right order. We need to make sure it's revealed at the right time, and we have to give fair, balanced reflection in terms of people. So if I'm making a program about you as an offender, I equally have to give you a voice in terms of if you're denying it. Yes, of course, it's less of a voice, and the evidence I have will overpower that voice. But likewise, we still have to treat people fairly.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Like you just touched on there with Oscar Pistorius. You filmed and stuff, and obviously what happened, and to this day, what was it like being around Oscar and his version of events? What was that like?
I mean, it was quite a surreal moment. I mean, I courted Oscar for a while. So when the murder happened on Valentine's Day, I remember a couple of days after that, it was a huge story, huge
worldwide, wasn't it?
Yeah, huge news. And I remember my producer at the time, she phoned me or sent me a message and said, Mark, why don't you see if you can get to Oscar? And at that stage, I'd done Savile, and getting to people was a relatively easy thing to do. So I sent an email to Oscar's PR agent, and she said, I'll add it to all the others. And I'm talking about, Oprah, ABC in Australia, which is the biggest.
All the big hitters.
I mean, the massive hitters, CNN, all of them. And they'd all put their bids in. At one stage, Oprah flew over there and put £1 million on the table for an interview. And Oscar said, no, I'm not doing it. Not doing it. Credit to him. He said, I'm not doing it. And his lawyers were saying, let the trial happen and everything. Anyway, and I put forward and said, listen, I want your story. I want your story. I want, I'm not here to put it in any other fashion. I just want you to tell me what's happened, but I will investigate you. And I remember being on his balcony the first time I we went over there to film, and I remember standing on this balcony and saying to Oscar, listen, if I find stuff that is detrimental to you, I will show it. I will show it. And I said, you've signed up to that. And he said, Mark, I wouldn't want anything else.
Really?
Yeah, he said, I wouldn't want anything else. And and as I got to know him and spend time with him, I started to, he was an incredibly driven and motivated individual. He was a young man who, you give a young man millions of pounds and you put a young man in fame as he had. There was 3 of the most famous people in South Africa: Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu and Oscar Pistorius. Those were the 3 most famous people, and actually they probably still are to date. If you spoke to people about South Africa, they, of a certain generation, they'd probably give you those 3 names. And when I spent time with Oscar and I started to get to know him and I started to get underneath kind of the Oscar and find out about him, he was, and still is, I find him, he's an incredibly sensitive, caring family man. And there's no doubt he loved Riva. I know that the problem is I get involved with very controversial things.
Yeah.
So I accept that there is always the other side.
There's opinion, Mark.
There is, whether it be Oscar, whether it be Jill Dando, whether it be Madeleine McCann, Jay Slater, all of those. There are 2 sides to it. But what I always say, and I will always listen to somebody else's voice if they'll listen to mine. Right? Yeah. What I always say is that I have the advantage of spending time with them. And I also have the advantage of knowing more than you know, because I've read the files, I've seen all the paperwork, I've seen correspondence that hasn't made it into public domain. I've been able to speak to friends, families, police officers, people involved in the case. So my knowledge of the case, by the time I start speaking about it, is infinitely more than somebody else. Now, that doesn't make their opinion not valid, but it does mean that they have to listen to someone that perhaps has more knowledge.
Yeah, you obviously, like you say, the files, speaking to other people where you've got access to all that, and you get a lot of people, these internet detectives who go, like, don't get me wrong, they've got an opinion, and that's what life is about today, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
But when you've got big cases like that, like you're saying, where you've got access, where you've read the files, you've spoken to family members, and you've got that little bit more knowledge than them, it's unbelievable with some of the stuff that you've actually dealt with, So, but what I want to do, Mark, as well, I want to, this individual, Jimmy Savile, how did that come about? When did it come to light? Was you investigating him, or was it just coincidence, or was it?
So I'd gone to Interpol at that stage. I was doing quite a lot of reports for BBC Newsnight. So BBC Newsnight, I was one of their kind of like guest presenters, and I'd come in and do stuff. And interestingly enough, since Savile, I have not presented a programme for the BBC, and I'm sure it's coincidental. But anyway, so I'd gone to Interpol. I was in Interpol, and we were just flying back with Marion Jones. And Marion said to me, who was the producer, so I was a reporter, he was a producer, and Marion said to me, have you ever heard about Jimmy Savile being a sex offender? And I went, no. I said, he's a weird bloke. I wouldn't want him anywhere near my kids, but I'd never heard that. Mm-hmm. He said, well, interestingly enough, either Surrey Police or Sussex Police have interviewed him under caution for it. They may even arrested him, but they certainly interviewed him under caution. I went, that's really strange, because I've never heard that. And if it had happened during my time in the police, given the roles that I was doing, I would have known.
You would have come across it.
I would have known. Someone would have said to me, because I was very heavily involved in the major crime aspects of it, I would have known. Particularly bearing in mind, whilst I was in the police, we did Jonathan King, and there's a number of other high-profile people that we did work on. So I heard nothing, and I said, I can make some inquiries and find out. Anyway, cut a long story short, spoke to a couple of senior people, both in the police force and who were not in the police force now, and they told me, yes, it was Surrey Police that interviewed him under caution at the Stoke Mandeville Hospital. And I thought, okay, so I went back to BBC Newsnight, and I said, he was interviewed by Surrey Police, and as a result of that, in the meantime, actually, in between me coming back from Interpol and me finding out that he was interviewed by Surrey Police, he died. It was quite a short space of time, and BBC said, we're going to make a programme about him. Obviously, I go back to him and say, look, he's died. He was interviewed by the police. The editor of BBC Newsnight said, well, it's not a story. And I remember Marion saying to me, he said, well, we're not doing it because it's not a story. I said, what do you mean it's not a story? He said, well, it's not a story because the editor believes that the police, if the police had done their job, which they obviously had done by interviewing him, it's not a police failure. And I went, but that's not the point here. The point is he's a high profile individual as a sex offender, isn't it? Isn't that the point? I said, it's secondary whether or not the police did anything.
Yeah.
Anyway, the editor couldn't get it. So I said, well, that's mad. I said, well, I'll run with it. I said, because obviously at that stage I was already working with ITV. And I said, well, let me take it to ITV. And he said, Mark, you're the only person that could probably get this off the ground. So I remember going to ITV and I remember saying to my exec producer, my producer and the head of legal, I remember sitting in the 6th floor room at ITV saying to him, look, I've got this story about Jimmy Savile being a sex offender. And I remember because my exec and also my producer obviously were completely on board, bought into this. And I remember the compliance, head of legal compliance going, Mark, this is a massive, massive hill to climb. How on earth do you think you're going to do that? He said, even though he's dead, how are you going to do that? Anyway, I said, well, look, I've got bits of evidence. I've got this and that. He said, that's not enough. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure that he is an offender. So I set out for the next 10 months to phone. And every day I kind of set myself a little list of people to phone. So I used a number of different websites, kind of like I used the old care association websites. I used Friends. What was the old Facebook? Friends. No, it wasn't. It was the other one when you were families and friends or something on Facebook. It was, I can't remember what it was called.
Oh, I'm sure to God.
Anyway, I used that to be able to find people. And every day I probably tried to find speak to about 10 people.
What was you going off, Mark? Was it just intelligence that you
had?
No,
so there was the care website. There was a children's home in Surrey, and there was 3 or 4 ex-carers who wrote on there saying JS and one other initial of a famous person were coming to the home and abusing children. Okay, so that was it. But no one had ever picked up on that. It'd been on the internet for quite a long time. No one had ever picked up on it, and I saw it, and I spoke to managed to track down a couple of people, and spoke to them, and most of them, even if something had happened, just didn't want to get involved. Anyway, so it was a lot of coaxing. It's a lot about saying to them, listen, you just take your time, have a think about it. Anyway, after about 3 months, we had a massive breakthrough where we got the name of one person as potentially being a victim of his. And I remember we got an address, and we went to this person, banged on the door, and she opened the door, and I said, who I was and what we were planning to do. And she just stood there, and I remember her standing there. I can see it in my head now, looking at me going, there's no way you can take him on. And I went, yeah, I said, there is. I'll take anyone on. I said, why is that? She said, because no one's ever been able to do it. She's been looked at before and no one's ever done it. And I said, well, will you talk to me? She said, well, why are you any different to anybody else? And I said, will you give me a go? Will you trust me?
Yeah.
And she said, give me a card and I'll think about it. So we left. And what we had as a bit of intelligence was something quite significant about her being a victim. And we left. And I remember coming away and I'm thinking, do you know what? And there was this kind of, I felt that the producer was with me, and I felt she connected more with her than me. So I said to her, I went back and I said about 3 or 4 days later, I said, have we heard anything? Because she didn't have my number, she had the producer's number. And she said, no. I said, I'll tell you what, you write her a letter and you go and deliver it and bang on the door and talk to her. And she did. And she spoke to her. And she said, yeah, I'll sit down and talk to you.
She opened up.
And then she said, can Mark come along? Because obviously, and she said, yeah, okay, yeah, bring Mark along. And I remember sitting down with her and we sat down and she just opened up and said, look, and she was actually the opening to the story, because prior to that, the victims were all from a children's home. And what we needed to remove it from the children's home, because we always knew, and having done many child abuse investigations in the police, it's very easy to label someone in the children's home as being trouble, being awkward and not truthful. So if we could find victims from there, outside, but also find survivors of victims from outside in a different walk of life, that was going to be really important for us. And I remember sitting down and her telling us the story. And I stopped her, because when I tell someone to tell me the story, I only want very briefness, because the first time I want you to tell me the story is the very first time that we either do it on camera or we record it. Okay, so you're not going to tell me. So if I take an account from someone as a victim, I would only ever take a very brief account, so I can kind of summarize and know what's gone on, and I will only ever do the full details when either, so it's recorded. So that's the first time they talk about it.
Yeah.
And I remember her talking about it, and when we did sit down and interview her, and we hid her identity. You know, when we hide people's identity, sometimes we put a wig on, but we also, if they wear makeup, so if they wear jewelry, then we take that jewelry off, and if they're non-jewelry wearers, we put jewelry on them. So we kind of like try and hide
disguise them
as much as possible. And I hate disguising people's voices, you know, because the problem is traditionally when people disguise someone's voices, they end up sounding like a Dalek or something really weird. Technology actually is better now, because you can tweak it a little bit and actually still change their voice. I remember taking her we went to a hotel, and I remember sitting down and interviewing her, and she told me, and I don't know what age this is. What's the age of this? Could I be quite? I'm not
Listen,
okay, so I remember talking to her, and she sat there, and she started to disclose how he raped her, and then she went on to disclose how he'd given her a sexually transmitted disease, and it was really, and this was as a young, and I remember listening to, and I've heard the worst of the worst, and I remember coming away from there and going for a coffee with Leslie afterwards, and saying to Leslie, "We've got to nail him." And it wasn't until that point, I knew that he was a sex offender, but it wasn't until that point that I knew we had to get him.
The severity of like what the lady just explained.
Yeah, we weren't going to give up, because actually at every point through the whole of that making of that program, at every point we were, I wouldn't say we're being blocked, but our work in order to get it commissioned and get it on screen was the most difficult I've ever had. It was never a cert. And actually there were times when I sat on the train, bizarrely enough, I remember going on the train, on the tube, and I said to Leslie, I don't think we're going to get this on screen. I really don't think we're going to get this on screen. And she said, "What are you going to do, Mark?" I said, "Do you know what? I don't know." I said, I might even phone Peter Jones up and ask Peter Jones if he'll back it. I didn't. We stayed with it, and we just kept
Peter Jones,
as in the millionaire, Peter Jones,
one of the
Dragon's Den.
Dragon's Den, yeah.
Because we just thought we needed someone to finance it. And to take
was there anyone trying to block it, Mark? Obviously knowing, because of this high profile.
Yeah, nobody wanted it commissioned. Nobody wanted it.
Even I mean, obviously ITV, for them, the numbers, and because you want to expose this monster, you know what I mean?
Everyone was so nervous.
Yeah.
Everyone was nervous.
But you were just driven and determined.
Oh yeah, that was for me. I mean, I'm an incredibly driven person, and when I sense injustice, it's kind of like, you know.
You're not backing down.
No. Yeah, I remember there was a piece in the paper. So BBC were very supportive of him. A lot of the local radio stations, BBC Leeds, and I remember a phone call one day from my agent at the time saying, "Oh, BBC Leeds have been on the phone. They want to do an interview with, because there was a piece in the paper saying, because we'd spoken to quite a lot of people, and some of the victims and some of his friends actually had come and supported him, saying, well, how on earth, why are you making this programme out? He's died." I remember that BBC Leeds were doing this for, how come this guy, Mark Williams-Thomas, is doing this investigation, wants to do this programme, he can't defend himself, what do you think? It was kind of an open chat thing, and it was a phone in, and they asked me to do it, and I said no. I remember listening to it, and I was listening to it on the basis that perhaps somebody might phone in and give us a piece of information. Anyway, they didn't. They all phoned up and just slagged off and said, leave the bloke alone. But I remember thinking to myself, you know, the more you say no, the more I want to do it. And my mum actually phoned me up. I remember I was feeding the chickens, and my mum phoned me up, and she said to me, she said, "Mark, I'm really worried that you're doing that programme. I'm really, really worried." And I went, "Why?" She said, "Well, because I think it'll just cause you a lot of problems, and you know, people will hate you." And I went, "Well, yeah." I said, "But," she said, "But I know I won't, there's no point in me telling you something, you know, if you've made your mind up." And I had made my mind up. I was going to do it. And I remember saying to Leslie at one stage, fairly early on, is I said, "Do you know what? This will either make it, we will either do well and make it in television as a result of this, or we'll never work in telly again."
And it like obviously.
Well, it only took off because we we had the voices of the 7 women. And, you know, I think everybody out there who was either a survivor of Savile or survivor of those many other offenders out there owe it to the women, the 5, the 6 women who put their confidence in us to tell their story. Because if it wasn't for them, and I was a facilitator, you know, I made the program, of course I did, and I fronted it up and I did the investigation, but it was their voice that carried. If they hadn't have put their confidence in me to tell their story, then it would never have got told. And I don't believe anybody else would have made it. I do believe if we hadn't have made that program, nothing would have happened to him. But actually, as a result of that, and putting their trust in us, and obviously us making and crafting it in such a way. And I remember the night, just a few days before, so we'd done the program was all ready, and we'd given it to the Mail on Sunday, and said to Mail on Sunday, look, you can have an exclusive on it. And the Mail on Sunday came back, and I remember on the Saturday talking to the Mail on Sunday, I was just watching my son play football, and they phoned up and said, can we just run through the story with you? And ITV press office had said, yeah, you can phone Mark. Anyway, and I said, yeah, okay. And I talked them through the story and the programme, and they'd seen clips of it. And they said, yeah, but have you got any more? It's not really big enough. And I went, what do you mean? And he said, well, we're not going to run it on the front page. We're going to run it on page 5 or 6 or something like that. And I went, right, okay. And then at that time, I also had and I still have a very good relationship with the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People. And I remember speaking to the editor, and they said, well, we're going to put it on the front pages. And they ran it on the front pages, and it ran, so the Jimmy Savile story, and of course it took its own life on afterwards, ran for 41 consecutive days on the front pages of the national newspapers. That's how big that story became.
And like you say, you know, everyone's got like you say, people who supported them and stuff, and he was just I was, you know, young. I remember seeing him on the TV. And he was just a strange character. You just knew. And then,
but he still has his supporters today. Yeah. You know, in light of that, I did that program, and then I also did a program called On the Run, which was to catch wanted criminals, which I loved. And I'd caught a couple of guys, and I caught one guy who said he was going to come after and shoot me. And then I got a letter bomb sent to me at ITV, addressed to me, and the only reason it got open, the only reason they called the fire brigade and the police was because there was a fluid leak from the side of it. Anyway, fire brigade turned up, police turned up, secure, evacuate ITV's building, and it turned out to be an incendiary device that would have blown your hand off if it had opened. But there was a leak of the fluid inside. Anyway, they tried to identify who it was, and they couldn't identify who it was, but that had come from, we thought at the time it might have been connected to On the Run, but that clearly came from somebody connected to Savile. But I got one day I was at home, and it was in the days afterwards. I mean, I can't tell you how mad it went afterwards. I mean, it literally
blew up. It just went mad.
Oh, I mean, I've covered big stories. I covered Madeleine McCann. I've covered Oscar Pistorius. This took on a life of its own, and of course, it took on a life of its own because of the appalling way the BBC dealt with it. Well, you know, which didn't help.
That's what I'm saying. The BBC, you know, a lot of people. You know, the BBC, the people in there, they must have knew what was going on, and it was just brushed under in these types of things, you know.
Well, it was a generational thing. So over the years,
the 70s, 80s, wasn't it?
Over the years, not everybody in current BBC higher management, of course, knew, because they didn't know him. He'd come and he'd gone. And I remember we wrote to the Director General and asked the Director General, so the head of BBC wrote to the Director General and said to him, as part of our programme, can we interview you in relation to the allegations that were made against Savile? And anyway, they came back with a very dismissive email basically saying, no, we're not going to put any up for interview, and we don't believe them, basically. So we went, right, okay, well, these allegations are very serious. Anyway, dismissed them the whole time. And we went through a process of about 3 or 4 rewrites of right to replies. So when we make a programme, if we're accusing somebody, we always give them a response, and we call that a right to reply. So we'll write to you, tell you what we're going to say in the programme, give you the opportunity to respond. That's called a right to reply. And we did that to BBC. In relation to the programme, and we were changing the script all the time because new bits of information were coming in, but more importantly, the BBC were learning new stuff, so they wanted to change their right to reply each time. Anyway, and on the morning of broadcast, they finally changed their right to reply from what they'd done about 4 days before, which was kind of to accept it and go, we're going to launch an inquiry and find out what's going on. But they handled it so badly. The Director General should simply have said, I hear the allegation, we take it really seriously. It wasn't on my watch, but we will open up an investigation and we will look to see what had taken place rather than dismiss it out of hand, which was there. And of course, the Director General subsequently, within a matter of weeks, had to resign because he made his position, untenable. And so, there's not many programs that cause the Director General of the BBC to resign.
That's what I'm saying. There's from that it's wrongdoing. At the end of the day, investigate it and hear people, because a lot of people get silenced and they don't want to. Do you know what I mean? Or they know there's wrongdoing going on.
Yeah. I don't think, people would say to me off the back, there was a number of people who came out, because of course it went massive, a number of people came out and said, oh yeah, I've been silenced, I can't say anything. And people would say that to me, and I remember putting a tweet out one day, go, listen, I can tell you, no one's been silenced. If there's one person that could have been silenced, it would have been me. No one's approached me, in terms of silencing me. No, silencing this concept that people are silenced. Is yes, it does happen. Of course, it happens. Listen, you're here in Liverpool, and we know all of the scenarios that have happened up here in relation to individuals being silenced. But the reality is, in a situation like that, no. People don't get silenced in respect of that. What happens is people make a choice of whether to say what they've seen or whether they've got a concern in relation to something. I interviewed one of the former governors of the BBC who said to me, he'd come forward, there was a newspaper article, the BBC article where he'd said when he was in charge of the children in need, he stopped Jimmy Savile from being involved in children in need. So I said to my team, let's interview him. So I went to interview him. And I sat down and I talked to him and I said, so what did you decide? He said, I decided the way he looked, the way he behaved in the office, I decided he shouldn't be involved in children in need.
There's something about him.
That's right. And I went, so tell me what that was. He said, the way he looked at the girls, the way he did that. And I said, okay. And he said, I took the decision not to use him. I said, okay, right, okay, fine, fair enough. Who did you tell? And he went, well, what do you mean, who did I tell? I said, well, you're a governor at the BBC, so you stop him being involved in children in need because you believe he's a wronger. Who did you tell the rest of the BBC so they didn't use him in other programmes and use him in other... I didn't tell anybody. I went, so you allowed him to continue elsewhere. Anyway, you could see kind of the penny drop in his head as he kind of swallowed deeply and thought, actually, this probably was...
He was still allowed to do,
Yeah, it's probably the worst interview I've decided to give. But he was like... there's Alan Franey who was Alan Franey became became in charge of Broadmoor, which is where Savile had keys for. Savile walked around Broadmoor, the most dangerous and
criminals that were
criminals and mentally ill criminals. And Savile was walking around amongst these people all the time. He was sexually abusing some of the girls that were in there, and he got his friend Alan Franey a job at Broadmoor as being in charge of Broadmoor when Alan Franey had no mental health history and he had no history of working in the criminal justice system, and he got him a job one day and he was in there and Savile was walking around. Savile was walking around with keys. Savile had access everywhere. The staff there hated him, absolutely hated him.
How did he have access, Mark? This is like the scary thing when you think about it. This man who you do see on your in the early 80s and stuff like that, and all right, he was all over RT. How did he have access to these like Broadmoor?
Yeah, but if you think in the time,
and the hospitals as well, I believe.
It's different now because television now has many platforms. In those days, the BBC attracted 10, 12, 20 million viewers on a weekend. Watch Jim Will Fix It and some of his other stuff. So he had a huge following. And I think when you get to that point in the status, it's amazing the amount of followers and people around you who turn a blind eye, and it's very difficult for them to say something because this guy has such status, and he had such status. So it's very difficult for them to say something. And I think that's what ended up happening with him. And he used that. He used that to his advantage. One of the things about offenders, it's all about access and opportunity. So he created the access and he created the opportunity by doing that. And I wrote, there was a piece in the Radio Times that quoted me and that I did off the back of the first Savile programme, which was basically to say, I think he created a vehicle to gain access to children.
Yeah. It's scary because obviously the celebrity status and, but like you say, these celebrities, like you say, there was like U3 and all that, like you had all these other celebrity or, in the public eye. You had Max Clifford, Rolf Harris and all stuff like that. they just think they're untouchable. You know what I mean?
Well, they did become untouchable. I remember the night we broadcast the Savile program, someone wrote into me and said, do you work for Max Clifford? And I sent an email back. It was about 12:15. I sent an email back going, no, why? And they said, he abused me. And I remember the following day, I phoned up the head of the Metropolitan Police's Operation U-Tree and said to him, will you take Max Clifford on? He said, yeah, of course I will. What do you know? It was quite interesting. Around that time, I used to have weekly meetings with the head of Operation U-Tree. And so what happened is that we would meet at various different cafes around London. And I would tell him what I know. He would tell me in terms of some of the information that he had, because there was so much information going out in the public domain, so much of it very inaccurate.
But that's another thing, though, Mark. You know, when evidence or goes out and the press puts something out and it's inaccurate, it can absolutely destroy it.
Totally destroy. I mean, I don't have it now, but at that period of time, in the months after that, I had execs from both the ITV, predominantly ITV, but sometimes via the BBC, people that I knew would phone me up and say, can I just run a name past you? Because everyone was really nervous. Some of the really high-profile people at ITV and BBC who are working with A-list celebs, who are working with really high-profile family names, would come to me and say, "Can I just run this name past you? Have you, do you know this name?" And of course, sometimes it's a did. Sometimes we go back and say, or say, well, I've never heard anything about that. But at the time, I was inundated. I had so many
celebrities
names,
and stuff like that.
So many names coming to me, and people would often say to me, at the time when I was doing interviews, but why do you go after the most famous people? Why do you go after the people who've got the high profile? And my response is a very simple one, which is, it's that they are the hardest people to take down. Taking down someone who's got a huge following, who's very, very famous, who's got lots of money, is far, far harder than taking down the local vicar, the local school team.
Joe Public.
And so therefore, if I can take them down, then it makes everybody touchable. And I would often say, and I still say it today, if you have abused a child, I want you to sleep very lightly at night. I want you to be worried that the next bang on the door will be the police.
That's the thing, innit? The sleeping with one eye open, and like you're saying, you're being inundated there where when that's Jimmy Savile's been exposed and people are like one eye open overnight. Yeah, they've been wrongdoing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and having been involved in getting Max Clifford arrested, getting Rolf Harris arrested, and some of those other people. But when it's wrong, it's wrong. And I think the reality is.
Did you deal with them, Mark?
Yeah, so I got Rolf Harris nicked. Max Clifford, I did a program on Max Clifford. We never broadcast a program on Max Clifford, actually. I've got it made, but it's never been broadcast.
Would that be something you'd like to try and get out there, or?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, there's some really. He was writing a book in prison, actually, before he died. I got to know his wife really well. Actually, it was really bizarre. We were making a program on Max Clifford, and I can't remember if I sent a letter, or probably was a letter to his wife, and I sent her a letter. And she phoned me up about 3 days later, and I remember answering the phone, and she said, "Oh, it's such and such here." And I went, "Oh yeah." She said, "You wrote me a letter about Max Clifford, about Max Clifford, Max Clifford." I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Why do you want to know? Why do you want to talk to me about it?" And it was a really weird moment, because at that point I didn't know whether she was supportive of him or against him. And so it was a real throw of the dice as to what I say, whether it was going to be. So, and I can't remember what I said to her, but it was obviously enough for her to then turn around and say, "I bloody hate him. I bloody hate him. What can I do?" And it took a lot of convincing, because she just said, "Look, I don't want to be on camera. I'll talk to you about stuff. I don't want to be on camera." She recorded him actually talking about. So he pretended to have this persona of this gay man. And she recorded him a number of times when he was doing that. But he was such a
high profile, Max Clifford.
He was. I mean, the biggest thing about. So we then went down a road, because we obviously got him in relation to the child abuse, but we then went down a road of blackmail in relation to him. So he was blackmailing quite a number of his clients.
Wasn't he a PR, like an agent? Was he an agent?
Yeah. So he was taking. So what happened is, so you were a high-profile individual and something was on you. So say you'd done something wrong, And so what he would do is he'd get you in his office and he'd say, right, tell me it all. Put it in the safe. And then he'd phone up one of his papers and he'd say to his papers, look, I've got a bit of a story for you. So he'd then sell that to the store, to that paper. And then something else you told him, he'd sell to another paper. And then he'd say to him, listen, I can keep you out the paper, but it's going to cost you another, 50 grand.
He was just on the take all the time.
Oh, making money all the time. And some of the people we went to meet a very, very famous footballer who we knew that he had conned money out twice.
Can you name them all?
Absolutely not.
No.
So we twice, and we went to meet this person's agent, very famous person, and we sat down with them, and they were really nervous. I sat down there with my producer, and we said to them, listen, with cards on the table, we know that Clifford has twice taken money off your client, and on the third occasion, your client has basically said to, or your personally run has said to him, do this again and we'll go to the police. And they didn't hear from Clifford again after that.
Was it substantial amounts as well, Mark?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, there's this very famous video that exists. And I won't tell you what's on it because it is quite shocking.
It's in the public domain anyway, isn't it? I don't
think it is.
Is it? No.
Don't think so.
Wasn't the one that was used? I think it was like a clip. And
no.
Do you know which one I mean? Where I think it was on the, I can't remember. Someone broadcasted it, and it was a clip of, and he was banged to rights on. I can't remember who he was.
No, so in one of my clips, so I've got a clip of Clifford talking about Al Fayed, talking about how he would cover up Al Fayed's crimes for him. But no, I've got a. There's a video. So Clifford would often go to dinner parties or hold dinner parties. And he held this dinner party one time, and at this dinner party, he put this video on. And there's videos of this very high-profile individual engaged in sexual activity, and he put this on at a dinner party. And I think a number of the people just left, and there was about 3 or 4 people in this room and watched it. And this video then exists. And so what happens is Clifford then phones this person up and says to them, I've got this video of you. To keep it out of the paper, it's going to cost you such and such.
Blackmailing,
right?
Yeah.
So the person then phones up his agent and says, look, Clifford's just told me this, if I have to pay. And he said, well, you got to go to police straight away. He said, but I can't. He said, because then they'll know who I am. Now, the thing is, of course, is with blackmail victims is that there is anonymity for blackmail victims. Okay, so that name cannot go out there for a blackmail victim. Okay, so it's one of the crimes where there is anonymity as long as sexual crimes. But he didn't want to risk that because he thought, do you know what? The way Clifford is, it will get leaked somewhere and something will happen. I'm sure it would have done. Yeah, I'm sure it would have done. So he pays. So I then, and the reason I tell you about there was a dinner party because there was 3 people at this dinner party, and 2 of those people I tracked down. And I spoke to them and I said, can you tell me about this video that exists? And anyway, they told me what was in the video independently, which was absolutely spot on because his wife told me what was in the video as well. Because he on one occasion,
she had 3 different people.
Yeah. So I phoned the person up. I phoned them up and I said to them, I said, this is a really difficult conversation, but I'm investigating Clifford and I've got a video. And he went, what? I went, a video of you, and I said, listen, this is so difficult. And anyway, he put the phone down. That was it. And I phoned him again about a week later. And he said, Mark, what do I say? What can I say? And I said, would you tell me? He said, Mark, no, how can I ever say anything about
embarrassed
it?
And,
he said, I can never say anything about it. And there was another element to it, which was the reason why he wouldn't say anything.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point being is that Clifford got away with a lot more crimes than what he was prosecuted for. And of course he died, but he was writing a book in prison. I got told by because his daughter hated me, but I got told by somebody connected to them that I was in the book, but I've never seen the manuscript. I think he's always hated me. I met him on the back stairs at Crown Court. We're at Snaresbrook Crown Court during his trial, and he was coming down the back stairs and the jury had gone out. And I remember him walking down the back stairs.
Cross paths.
And I was going down, he was going up. And I said to him, what do you think? And he went, do you know what? He said, I think I'm going to get away with a few. He said, I think I'm going to get away. He said, they might find me guilty on a few, but I think I'm going to get away. And I said, do you know what? You're going to jail for a long time.
Was he that confident?
Oh, cocky git. Yeah, he'd go in and he was still courting the press during the court. So the press
Was he giving them bits, snippets, and
no, just chatting with them and laughing away. I mean, we'd be in the press. I'd be in the waiting room, the waiting room by the court, which was dominated by the press. You know, the tickets were sold to be able to get in there, and I remember being in there, and he'd come in the mornings, and he'd be joking, he'd be laughing, and I mean, I didn't have anything to do with him, but.
That's just strange behaviour, that straight away, isn't it? You know what I mean?
You're looking at. He'd always got away with it, so he thought he was going to get away with it.
He thought he was untouchable. Mark, you know, this case, I wanted to speak to you about the Jill Dando case when it was 1999, I think it was, wasn't it? She was shot outside her home. Your honest opinion, Mark, and like a lot of people have said this to me, or I've seen, you know, as well, and people spoke about it. Was Jill Dando going to expose a high-profile paedophile?
I can tell you 100 million.
Because that's a lot of theory that's out there.
And this is the problem. Of course, stories take a life of their own.
Yeah, yeah.
And someone says it. No, totally untrue. Totally untrue. Jill Dando was murdered. We don't know why she was murdered. We can have a good guess why she was murdered. But I can tell you it had absolutely nothing to do with her either exposing something, any to do with it. Jill Dando was a television presenter.
Crime Watch, remember on Crime Watch and stuff
like that? She wasn't a reporter. She wasn't an investigator. You know, Jill had nothing to do with that. And that story, unfortunately, has taken a life on its own. It's completely untrue.
Fabricated.
Utterly untrue. You know, it's annoying when people come up and just make stuff up. It's not true.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got the whole court case. I've got the whole of the files. I've got the whole of Metropolitan Police's case files.
Yeah.
You know, I had every single case file put onto so it can be searched on a computer. No, there's not a single thing in there about it. And I can tell you, having spoken to her family, having spoken to people that work with her, there is not an ounce of credibility to that.
Did they catch the right man for it?
No.
Barry George.
No, Barry George is. No, I mean,
he was stitched. Like, well, you know, he stitched up. He was.
Barry George. I mean, Barry George. I've spent a lot of time with Barry George, and I know Barry George's sister very well, Michelle. No, Barry wasn't responsible for that. Barry has got his issues. There's no doubt. I mean, he got convicted for some things. You know, Barry's no innocent individual walking away.
But for that though, Mark, that's
no, they got it wrong. But then, you know, I kind of in a very different way. You know, it's like. Christian Bruckner for Madeleine McCann. Christian Bruckner's not responsible for Madeleine McCann's abduction. He's got some horrific crimes that he's committed.
Yeah.
But there's a massive difference in committing a crime.
What's in it for?
To murdering somebody. Barry George, absolutely. I mean, Jill Dando is murdered on her doorstep in the early morning, broad daylight. Takes about 5 seconds, and the offender's vanished and disappeared. Single shot to the head. Barry George capable of doing that? I mean, if Barry George had done that, he would have gone and told the rest he would have walked out and told the street. He didn't have that. Barry George, not capacity. I've sat through hours, 12, 14 hours of video interviews with Barry George when he was interviewed. And at every point he's going, no, sir. He sits there, no, sir. And he gives his answers, yes, sir, at every single point. And they constantly say to him, Barry, you killed Jill Dando, didn't you? And he sits there and he goes, no, I did not, sir. No, I did not. At no point. And he's a vulnerable individual. I mean, he got mental health things. No appropriate adult in the interview. Shocking, really. No appropriate adult in the interview. No stage.
I just think they were pushing that so much on him, Mark, from the off. It was from the off, though, wasn't it? It was straight.
Well, no, it wasn't really from the off, because actually it took a year for Barry George's name to come into the inquiry.
Was it really? Yeah.
So it took a year for Barry George's name to come into the inquiry, and then they became fixated on him. They became utterly fixated. So Hamish Campbell, who was the officer in charge of the case, he became utterly fixated on him. And in fact, the third offender profile. So there's three offender profiles done. The first 2 offender profiles. So the basis of an offender profile is when you don't know who the offender is.
Yeah. Okay,
so you can't do an offender profile if you know who the offender is, right? So the offender profile is about saying male, white, likely to live in the vicinity, might have a sexual interest in this, may have convictions there. You know, it's a generality. Okay, that's what profiles are there. And the purpose of writing a profile is as an aid for the officer in the case to try and narrow it down. All right. So 2 profiles are written. They then put Barry George in a frame, and they write a 3rd profile after his address has been searched And the third profile profiles Barry George, saying, well, the person's likely to have photographs of Jill Dando or blonde women in his arrest, likely to have an interest in this. It was written to fit Barry George. And actually, we know that when that was released, it was released with the intention that it was going to encourage Barry to do something. So they had him under surveillance, hoping he was going to go and leg it or do something. Barry didn't do anything.
He didn't get off on his toes or nothing.
He didn't do anything. He didn't. I mean, there was no understanding, because at that stage he didn't know he'd searched his house. Anyway, so they have all they have all of this, and no, Barry's absolutely not responsible. But I phoned Hamish Campbell. Hamish Campbell now, or at the time, this was a couple of years ago, he'd got a very cushy job abroad, and I remember phoning Hamish and saying to Hamish, "Come on, I've got evidence here that clearly shows the third offender profile was written with Barry George in mind, which is completely unethical in terms of how offender profiles should be done, and actually made the public think, oh yeah, you've got the right man." Okay, totally wrong. I said, well, you give him an interview in relation to that. He said, well, how did you get the offender profile? I said, well, I did, because I've got hold of it. And he said, Mark, you know what? Of course I'm not going to give you an interview. He said, why would I give you an interview? And I said, well, why not? He said, well, because you'll ask me things, and I'm not going to give you an interview. But I've had that before. When I remember doing a story years ago on Facebook, and I remember talking to the head of Facebook and saying, would you give me an interview? I said, Mark, you are the last person I'd give an interview to, because you'll pull me apart. I said, well.
And what does that feel like, Mark? Because obviously you're approaching these people in high-profile cases, or people high up, and, like they're saying there, you're going to rip us apart or whatever. But
well, they won't give me an interview, will they? Most people.
Yeah.
Most people. I mean, I remember interviewing Alan Franey in relation to Jimmy Savile, and I didn't actually set it up. It was set up by my colleague. And if you watch that interview, you'll see him slowly fall apart, because actually I just say, look, you know what? Pull him apart. And
it's demeanour just changes.
It's like the Investigator series. I don't know if you've seen the Investigator series. When we take the guy to the island, when he comes up with this full story that there was a man overboard, and that Carol Packman was alive and things. And actually, when we took him over there and took him on the boat and brought him off on the boat, and I remember standing on the shore with him, and he gives me this story, and he's just told me for the last hour whilst we're in this boat sailing around, the story, which was the fact that she was on the boat and so on. And then I get on the platform, I get on the jetty, and I remember saying to him, okay, so he tells me the story again. And I said, that's not true, isn't it? I said, we've got confirmation that Russell left the boat. When it come back, he didn't fall off the boat at all. And you could see this kind of like moment in his head, and he thinks, I've just been caught out.
Yeah.
and it's from that. And actually, I love those moments when you actually have led somebody down a path, and then you literally confront them, and then
you nail them.
Which I love, confronting people. I love when you get to the position you can actually confront somebody. I mean, I confronted Nicola Payne's murderer recently. And
you must be reading my questions, because that's all in all. You know what I mean? It's just, but the Nicola Payne case again. That's like another horrific.
Yeah, I mean, there's a man accused of Nicola Payne's murder. I say he's maintained his innocence. He went to court and got found not guilty. But he has got some serious questions still to answer in relation to that. And I confronted him and put those questions to him. And I'm convinced that the murder of Nicola Payne is linked to another murder. It remains unsolved, and sadly will probably remain unsolved until such time as Nicola's body can be found. But the reality is there are, as for every murder, unsolved murders, and there is an excess of 3,000 unsolved murders in the UK, dating back to the early 1960s, only because that's what they recorded. There will be more than that, and those are only murders that have been recorded as murders. So if you think of the 70s and 80s, there are quite a lot of cases where particularly women have just vanished. Their husband will have reported them missing, or maybe not even missing, but they took they had enough and they just left. Okay, and they've not been recorded as murders. And I can tell you a number of cases where family have got in contact with me and said, look, my mum just vanished.
No one just vanishes, Mark.
And my mum's just vanished, and it's never been reported as a murder, but I'm convinced my dad killed her. So I've got a number of those cases, and but of murders themselves, recorded as murders, in excess of 3,000 unsolved murders, and we can't keep up to date with the current murders. So there are sadly murders out there that will never be
unsolved.
But that means that there are murderers walking amongst us. So next time you walk into a supermarket, you never know, the person holding open that door might be a killer.
That's crazy. Just going back to the Nicola Payne case, Mark, was it, I don't know if it's the same one, but where you and your team, where you confront a guy and he's getting in his van and he's closing the van?
Yeah, that's Nicola Payne. Yeah.
I remember watching it.
Yeah.
And I remember watching that footage, and you're trying to speak to him, he's trying to close the door, and you just like, you're confronting him, so you're just asking him questions.
I mean, I think at that case, I mean, he didn't actually drive off with me in the door, but I remember confronting a guy in Spain. We'd gone to track down a sex offender wanted in Spain, and we tracked him down to one of the Spanish islands. And I remember he got in his car, and as he got in his car, he was. I put my hand on the top of the windows, and the window was open probably about that big. I put my hand on the window, and literally he wound it up or pressed the button. I don't know what it was. And I very quickly took my fingers out, otherwise I probably wouldn't have had any fingers left today. And then he drove off.
Do you ever think, Mark, how much goes into this to track people down? The hard, the long nights, the long hours, to finally try and, you catch these people. You've found this fella in Spain. What goes into it, Mark?
Huge amounts. I mean, I think there are, and most of the time, I don't take failure very well. Success for me is so important. And I'm very hard on myself if I get things wrong. But I have learnt over time to give things time. So sometimes I've started with a case, and years later I still haven't resolved it, but I'll never give up. It's still in the back of my mind thinking one day I'll solve that, because sometimes you have to give it time, and sometimes stepping away from it gives it time. And also allows you to think, is there another way I can do this? Is there a different way? I remember, Jessie Earle was a young girl who was murdered, I think certainly by Peter Tobit, and it was part of the investigative series. And when I went to see Jessie's parents. So Jessie's parents had never done any, they'd done program stories initially in the media, and then for 10 years they stood away from the media. They said, look, we're not doing any media, it's taken over our lives. And one of my team went to see them and said, look, we're really interested in featuring this program, would you do it? And they said, no. And said, well, listen, would you just meet Mark? Would you just meet Mark and just let him explain to you why, I think it's a really important program to do. So I went to see them. And they said, and I explained to them and said, look, it's very high profile, big audience and so on. And this is what I want to do. And they said to me, they said, we want one of two things. I said, well, what do you want from me? They said, one of two things. They said, one, of course, we'd love to catch the killer.
Yeah.
But secondly, the verdict of the coroner's inquest was wrong. And we want to appeal that, but we've been told we can't do it. And I said, listen, park that for now. We'll deal with see if we can catch the killer. And when I go and visit people and talk to them about making a program, I always say to them, I cannot, and normally they've come to me because it's the last option they've done. They've done loads of media, they've done the police, nothing's happened. And I say to them, listen, I can't guarantee I will solve your case. I can't guarantee I'll catch your killer. But what I will give you some guarantees in is I will find new information. I will find something new that you've not had. And I can do that because I've now done this for long enough to know that I will always find something new, and I always have done. And so I can give that as a guarantee now, and I always do. And I remember telling them and saying, look, let's see what we can do. And we found some really good evidence linking Tobin, not enough that would amount to a charge. And I went back to them afterwards and said to them, let me see if I can get your a new inquest. And they said, well, how are you going to do that? The police have said, it's impossible. And I said, let me see what I can do. So I got hold of a QC, as it was then when the Queen was alive, and a solicitor, and I said, listen, for free, would you work with me, and let's see if we can get this family a new inquest. And I said, before you make your mind up, come and see them with me. Come and see them with me. So I took them to go and see the family. The three of us went to see the family. We sat with, four of us actually, because we pulled in another guy who was an expert in coronial law, which is coroner's law. And we sat down with the family, and the families just talked, and I talked them all through it. And we walked out and we went to the pub, and I said, what do you think? And they said, we're in. We hate it that family had been put through that. So we worked tirelessly for the best part of 18 months to get a new inquest, not assisted by the police. The police refused to even assist in any way. In fact, they said, well, we're not objecting to it, but we're just going to sit on the fence, and we're not going to give you, we're not going to support or be negative. Anyway, as a result of that, we then managed to get a new inquest. And as a result of the new inquest, we got the verdict overturned to murder. which was, and I remember the family afterwards saying to me, Mark, we could just never have done this if you hadn't have kept going. And I remember at one stage they phoned me up and said, Mark, we are so tired. We just can't keep this up. We're so tired. And I said, listen, if I just do it and I'll talk to you when it's necessary, or if you can talk to me whenever you want, will you just trust me and let me do this? And they said, okay, do that. And I did, and we got them a result.
How did that make you feel, Mark? How did that, like, that particular case? You know?
Well, I think, you know, we do things because we have, because we care, you know, and I care massively about the things that I do. And I think we do things to try and make people's lives easier. And I think not everyone's like that. You know, some people are caring, some people aren't caring. But I take that as a really important part of what I do, you know, to try and make someone's life easy. And if I can do it because I've got the skills and the contacts, then great. And, you know, we're all put on this planet for a reason, aren't we?
Yeah,
and
of
I
course.
think we all find our vocation and what that is. And, you know, I'm not a rich person because I've chosen kind of to do something, and I help people out all the time. You know, I'm my worst enemy.
Yeah, but this is a question I was going to ask a little bit. You know, the time that you give, you're not part of an association. You know what I mean? So it's not like saying freelance or whatever. But how do you you work, and do you work with the police, or do people hire you, and you know what you do it for free or whatever?
No, so I mean
because someone asked me that, and I said, I will certainly ask them.
So I work in different ways. So many families will come to me and they'll say, "Can you help me?" And we always end up having conversations. You know, okay, what are you looking for? Most of the time, it's obviously exposure, program, whatever it is, media. I always try as much as I can with the family to try and get obviously the media to pay. So whether that be a television program, a newspaper, that's not always possible because obviously it's you know, money's tight in those circles now. So then you obviously explore whether they've got the money to be able to do it, and sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't, and then of course sometimes it's the person, you know, it's kind of the pull on the heartstrings of me, and I think, you know what, and so I for years I've done far too much for free, and I do, you know, people will often say, oh yeah, but you always make out of this, you're doing this. I don't, you know, 90% of the time, actually, sadly, you know, I do so many cases because I care. You know, I've got a big case at the moment where I've invested a huge amount of money, and it is the most incredible case. We just can't get a broadcaster at the moment to run with it.
Can you talk about it or not?
I mean, it's a huge story where basically we're going to solve 5 murders. And we're going to go and dig and find a body. But we just can't get anybody at the moment who wants to put the money behind the back of that. If we had someone who said, look, here it is, here's the money, we'll go and search it straight. And when we know, because this person is convinced that that body is there, and I actually have to say, the evidence they've given us stacks up.
It's stacked, yeah.
And so if we search this area and we find the body, we will then solve another 4 murders straight away. And that person is going to fully admit to the murders and go to jail for it. So it's huge. It's never been done. I've got a confession on tape, but we just need somebody who's going to say, here we are, look, here we are, here's the money, we'll back it. And because ultimately, at the end of the day, if the body is there, then we've got a commission, and we've got it's never been done on telly before. There is never a programme that's ever been done where a search has taken place and the body has been found, other than by the police, of course.
Yeah. That's absolutely madness, Mark.
So if any of your listeners
want
to come along and fund that, I'm more than happy to.
Well, listen, hopefully, you know, someone out there comes across this and, you know, certainly is very interested and they can back it and support it as much as they can. But you balance family life and stuff like that when you're doing sort of what you're doing, you know, because you're dedicated, you know, you're driven, you know, it's, oh yeah, just 1 more hour. I say to my missus, I'll give you 1 more, and she's like, Tony, that was 4 hours ago, 5 hours ago. Do you know what I mean? And
I've got much better.
Yeah,
I've got much better. I was a complete, you know, workaholic, but actually
that's the word, workaholic.
Yeah, but things have changed in my life. I've got an amazing partner now.
Yeah, and she understands, and I'm listening.
And I think, you know, I think that you as you grow older, you realise that, you know what, different things are important in your life. And
getting the balance, Mark, in it.
Yeah, and I don't think we ever get the balance right, because the balance is a difficult balance to get, but you actually have to. And you know, I suppose I'm in a position where I've done an awful lot, you know, and but you live for those. I mean, those moments of success are, of course, the moments that we want. It's like the moments when someone says, thank you, thanks for doing that, or you made a difference. Just those little things. Because actually, we rarely do that. As a society, we're really poor of praising people. We just let you might deep down think, okay, they did a really good job, but just tell them. Just say to them.
Goes a long way,
you know
Mark.
what?
That does go a long way. Just like you can change someone. That one word, or that could just change that person. You don't know what's going on behind closed doors. That person, it could turn.
Even if
you know what I mean?
Just say to them. Even if you think it, just say to them, "Yeah, well done. It's a good job. Really well done. I'm really proud of you. Whatever you've done." Or they really rate you, or just something like just And every day, I always say, to people. I used to do quite a bit of motivational talking to schools, and I would say to them, just every day, just say something nice to somebody.
Like you say, that could just cheer that person's day up completely. I've got tons of what's names I'm going to hit you with, Mark, and we're not going to be here all night. But look, the one I want to speak about as well, and a couple of our followers, and that said, look, the Madeleine McCann case was worldwide news and stuff like that. What and obviously you spoke about this on many occasions, on many other podcasts and stuff. But what do you think went on that night, Mark? What do you believe, or what do you know that that people are
I can only tell you from what the evidence tells me.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean to say that this is the answer, because ultimately, one, possibly two, possibly three people know what happened. Okay, so two people definitely know, but obviously one's very young, but there may be slightly more than that. All I can tell you, I was there within 72 hours on the ground in Pride de Luz. So I was able to give a very informed view in terms of what was going on, how the police were dealing with, what the area looked like, what the reaction was of both Jerry and Kate, but also the other friends that were there. And I, having looked at all the evidence, everything tells us that actually the reality is that it's most probably she wandered off, and that she was abducted by a predatory paedophile. And I say that, and people would say to me, hang on a minute, yeah, but what's the likelihood of that? And I used to go to Texas every year and speak at a big law enforcement conference. And I remember one year I went there and spoke about child abductions. And it's predominantly law enforcement, but mainly 85% the FBI. And the FBI are kind of like the leaders in relation to child abduction. So when we talk about child abductions in the UK, multiply it by 10, and that's how many the Americas have, the US has. And actually, the abduction of a child by a stranger is very rare, very, very rare. And it's very rare because, of course, the reality is if you abduct a child and there's no grooming process, that child will disclose on you. Okay, so the grooming process is the imbalance when the power indifference changes from the adult to the child, and the child starts to feel guilty and therefore doesn't talk. Okay, so the first time a child is abused is the most likely time that child will disclose. Thereafter, the power imbalance shifts. Yeah, because that child starts to feel guilty, etc., etc., etc. Obviously not true, but that's how the reality of the situation is. So what we end up with is that when you abduct a child for the first time as a stranger, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision, because if you allow that child to return, they'll disclose on you.
They'll tell you who it was who took them.
So you have to make a decision, and that decision on a stranger abductions is 99% of the time to be murdered. Now, the window of opportunity as far as that murdering will be quite narrow, because the longer you hold on to the child, the greater the risk of getting caught. And of course, within today's world, where communication exists very quickly, you get the reality is that communication spreads very quickly. So within a space of like half an hour to an hour, it can be on the news.
Yeah.
Okay, so you run a huge risk of that. So that's why the window of opportunity for the murder of a child of a stranger tends to be within 3 hours. Okay, so we're talking very, very quick. Right, and the FBI have done a huge amount of research around this, and there's lots of papers that exist around that. So I believe on that morning, we do know that Madeleine woke up in the early hours. Late at night, we know that Madeleine woke up because in the morning, she said to Jerry and Kate, so this is the morning that she disappeared, right? The day of. So the day of her disappearing, on that morning, she spoke to Mum and Dad and said to them, Sean and Annalise woke up last night. Now, we know that they'd woken up in the preceding night because the neighbour had said, we've heard the children crying. Okay? So mum and dad, in age appropriate way, said, well, we're only at the bar behind the back, which is just over the thing. Now, the reality is, in order to get to the bar, you had to walk out of the back of the property onto a public road, down a public road about 50, 60 yards, back into the complex, and then go to the back where the swimming pool is. So you had to go onto public to come round, and there was no line of sight between the tapas bar and the back door because there was a tree in the way. Okay, so it wasn't a clear line of sight. So you could get into the back of the property without being seen. All right. So on that morning, we know that Madeleine therefore knew where mum and dad were. All right. So I believe on that night, Sean and Annalise woke up and Madeleine went to find mum and dad. And as she went to find mum and dad, she came out of the apartment because we do know that the property was insecure. It was really hot. I was in there 72 hours afterwards and it was really hot. Those properties don't have air conditioning. So the only way in order to get air to circulate is to open a window front and back in order for the air to circulate through. And that's what I believe happened. We do know that the back door was insecure because we know when Jerry went there that the back door was insecure. So I believe Madeleine walks out onto the pavement. Now you would then say, well, hang on a minute, the opportunity to abduct a child is seconds. And I get that. But if you look at research in terms of the UK and particularly in terms of the US, but let's take the two UK cases. So Jeanette Tate, 1978, she vanished from the West Country and she was out delivering newspapers. She was with her friends. Her friends were a short distance behind her on a pedal cycle. And as she cycled over the brow of the hill, she got to the bottom of the hill. The friends came to the top of the hill. And when they got to the top of the hill and just came over, her bike was on the bottom and she'd vanished. Her body has never been found. Jeanette's never been found. The likelihood is that Robert Black, who is now dead, who was a paedophile, has abducted her. Unsolved case. But she vanished within a very small window of opportunity, which was a matter of seconds. And then you look at the very high-profile case of Sarah Payne, who was abducted by Roy Whiting. So Roy Whiting, on the morning of Sarah's abduction, did not target Sarah. He was going out to abduct a child, but not Sarah. He had no idea Sarah was around. He ends up going to a location and he sees Sarah walking through a field. So Sarah had been out with her parents and I think and her brother, and they'd walked through a hole in a fence, but separating two fields. And as they walked through this hole in the fence, Sarah was in front, parents, then brother, then parents. And as Sarah goes through, they lose sight of her. Brother walks through, and as brother walks through, he sees the tail of a white van driving away. Okay, that was Roy Whiting's van, and Sarah was in that van, and he subsequently sexually assaults her and murders her. That is in a matter of seconds. So what we know about predatory paedophiles who abduct strangers is that not only is it a matter of opportunistic, and it's totally opportunistic. Yeah. So Robert Black didn't target Jeanette Tate, he just happened to be there. Roy Whiting didn't target Sarah Payne, happened to be there. That's seconds, and we also know it's totally opportunistic. So when you talk about the reality of Madeleine, did she walk out the apartment? Seconds between going between the bar, and opportunistic.
It's crazy because, like you say, it's same again. There's all these theories. There's all these, people.
Yeah, I think one of the key things to say about Jerry and Kate, and they know me very well, and obviously I've been very, very clear and very forthright in terms of what I've said. Is that if Jerry and Kate, from that moment, had said, "We made the worst mistake of our life. We should never have left Madeleine and the twins in the apartment that night, and as a result of that we have to suffer the consequences of that for the rest of our lives." It's a life-changing moment, and we will regret that. We will regret that for the end of life. That's what they should have said. But they came out and tried to defend what I would say is an indefensible position, because there will be parents and generational parents, our parents' generation, not us. I mean, I don't think our generation took buggies and sat in the bars with kids in their buggies. But I think generations before that would often take children abroad and probably put them in a room and go off and have a drink. Not everyone, but obviously there were people, and I'm sure there are people that still do that. But if you do that and your child goes missing or something happens, then you have to take the consequences of that. It's very rare. I mean, the abduction of a child is so rare that this isn't going to happen in 99.999 recurring people's lifetime. But when it does happen,
It's
it's life changing, and you can't justify that.
What would you have done differently, Mark, if you been in charge of that case?
Well, I just sealed the area forensically. I remember going out there, and within 72 hours, I remember going out there and making a comment, which I think was I think I was on the Sunday perhaps, and on the Tuesday, front page of the newspapers was me slating the Portuguese police for failing to preserve a crime scene.
What were they like with you, the police, after that? You know what I mean? What were the Portuguese police? Did they have it in for you?
Yeah, well, I remember flying over there on one occasion and the producer saying to me, I'm surprised they let you in the country.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the Portuguese... So Gonzalo Amaral, obviously, was the investigating officer that took charge of that case. Him and I don't see eye to eye at all. I mean, he won't give me an interview. I'd be happy to sit and talk to him. Absolutely no problems at all. And he won't give me an interview because his theory to it makes absolutely no sense. And in fact, this is where the challenge is. I don't know what happened to Madeleine, but neither do you. Neither does every other member of the society, unless they were involved in it, which is one or two people. And everyone's got a view, and I buy that. I have no problem with that. What I do have a problem with is if when you look at what people are saying, whether it stacks up on a common sense level. You know, Madeleine could not have been in the back of that vehicle when a vehicle was... So there's this idea that Madeleine was in the back of a higher vehicle because her DNA was identified.
Yeah, the DNA, yeah.
But the common sense tells you that's impossible, because when Madeleine was when Madeleine vanished, she, wherever her body is, and say the parents were involved, they would have had to have buried her, right? At that point, there was no press and no people around. Within a matter of hours or days, let's say the next day, the press was there. So 18 days later, or how many days later was when they hired the vehicle, it would have meant, under the glare and the spotlight of the national media, and also the police, who had by this stage put trackers and were listening to the phones of the McCanns, they would have dug up a body, which at this stage would no longer have been a body because the body decomposes really quickly, put it in the back of a hire car under the glare of the media and driven it to location and reburied it. Sorry, what are you talking about? So they've literally done that under the glare of
invisible,
everything taking place.
What I mean?
And then where have they buried this body now? Okay, so but it's not even a body. The reality is the reason that DNA got picked up in the back of that vehicle was because they transferred all of Madeleine's items and property from the apartment to a new apartment. Of course, there's transfer of fibres, there's transfer of her clothes
and stuff like that.
That's the DNA sample. And in fact, the DNA was not an exact hit. This is where it went wrong. So the story came out, there was an exact hit of DNA. That's not true. There wasn't.
It's absolutely, and we could go on all night about it, which, you know, if you know what people want to know and stuff like that, Mark. And
it's one of the biggest stories, and whenever I used to do talks, people would I could guarantee at the end of the talk, I'd always have a question about Madeleine McCann. It transferred. I mean, I remember at the time, literally, I was doing some work with Robson Green, the actor Robson Green.
Yeah.
And I went to meet Robson, and we went to have dinner in London, and Robson said to me, he said, Mark, he said, I don't want to, we were doing a project. He was doing his I can't remember what he called it, the film, the crimey thing that he was doing. And he said, Mark, he said, we're going to have another lunch for this because I just want to talk about Madeleine McCann.
Because he wanted to know, like, obviously what you knew and stuff like that. But that's just one of the high profile cases. But Mark, there's many more I want to speak about, but this one that sticks out for me because I was actually over in Tenerife when Jay Slater, 2024, 18-year-old lad, again, internet detectives. What do you believe? And, you know, obviously, you know, we've got to be what's in because the family and stuff like that, like with all cases. What do you believe actually happened to Jay Slater?
I mean, it was a bizarre story, wasn't it? Because it took off. I remember giving a comment on it, seeing it, and I think I saw it in the Mail, made a comment on it, and then suddenly thought, this is big. This is going to go big.
It went mad.
But then look at Nicola Bulley's story. You know, Nicola Bulley's case went massive. The young lady in terms of the
Lancashire
water.
was that?
Lancashire, yeah. So that story went massive, and these stories go massive for a number of different reasons. They go massive because of the void of information, or the information's incorrect and been put out there. on today's world, of course, social media takes its own, look at it and literally blows it up. And I think Jay Slater's was that it was quite quiet in the news. There wasn't particularly anything happened. Nicola Bulley had already happened, and that was massive. And so kind of the same internet detectives have kind of jumped onto Jay Slater. And of course it was, people don't just vanish. And so of course that created in itself a vacuum of information. And that vacuum of information then either gets filled or doesn't get filled, but it gets filled by somebody if it starts to attract media attention. And I remember speaking to the family. One of the massive advantages of when a story breaks, I can get to a family pretty quickly. So when Nicola Bulley's story broke, I remember the father phoning me up. The husband phoned me up. So I had the husband's number. That's right. I got given the husband's number. I phoned him up. He said, "Oh, Mark, thank you so much. We're desperate for some help. We just don't know what to do." And this is the thing. When a family is suddenly launched into the world spotlight, they've got the media banging on their door. They've got everybody wants to talk to them. They don't know what to do. And we are talking phones going mad. We're talking articles being written. And of course, if you're the subject to a story, also, as well as covering the story, they want to find out about you or the family. So there's a lot of digging taking place. And of course, that creates lots of questions. And literally, they were thrown into the middle of it. And I remember quite quickly phoning up and speaking to the family. And I said, "Look, listen, I'm more than happy to come and have a chat and see if I can help." And they said, "Well, what do you think you could do?" I said, "Well, being on the ground, I could probably get you some answers quite quickly in terms of what could have happened." So I jumped on a plane, went over there. And actually, when I went over there to cover the Jay Slater initially, I just did it off my own back. I wasn't doing it for a paper, although the Mirror I ended up working with type of thing. And I went over there to help the family. I said to them, "Listen," and they said, "Well, listen, we're desperate." Because so it was a relative of the family said, "Please, Mark, could you help?" And I remember speaking to the family, said, "Listen, we don't know what to do. We just don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, would it help if I came over?" And they said, "Yeah, just help us. We don't know what to do." And I remember flying over there and meeting the family. And when I sat in the back of the car with Debbie and Debbie's sister or brother, can't remember which one it was.
Is that Jay's mum, was it?
Yeah, so Jay's mum,
Debbie.
Yeah,
Jay Slater's mum.
Sat in the back of the car with them, and Debbie's like, "I just don't want the police to stop working with us because you say something to upset the police." I said that's not going to happen. I said, let's just work together. I said, let's see what we can find. I said, but ultimately, it isn't about upsetting the police. This is about doing the right thing for Jay and finding Jay. And if the police are not doing it right, then they need to be told, And I have that relationship with the British police now. Sometimes when the British police get things wrong, I'll phone them up. Well, I'm Nicola Bulley, and I remember phoning up the head of press of Nicola Bulley and said, "What have you done?"
Did they release what's saying that all the information?
Yeah, and I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Why?" I said, "You got this completely wrong." And they went, "We know we have Mark. We're trying to fix it at the moment." I said, "Well, just be honest and be straight. Don't give rubbish." And he went, "Yeah, we know." And actually, I then ended up going on speaking at the National Policing Conference around how the police totally failed with Nicola Bulley. But anyway, going back to Jay Slater. So I'm there with the family, and they said, "Well, okay, will you come and see us in the morning?" So I remember going to see the family, all of them, and introduced to Jay's dad and the brothers and the friends. And we sat down in their little apartment. We just went through everything, really. I just wanted to kind of get an understanding of what Jay is a person, read the messages on her phone, understand what had taken place. I then went to the scene, and then over the period of kind of the next 3 days, I went to the scene, I looked at it all, and I said to the family, "Listen, there's a pivotal moment in any investigation where the press has a potential to turn on you, okay? Not in a way that's necessarily driven because they don't like you. It's just because other information might happen and other information comes in. And what's really important when you are the victim, when you are a family in the middle of the investigation, is to keep the press on side. And you can keep the press on side by working with them, engaging with them, giving pieces of information, being honest. And I said to him, "Listen, just give a press conference. Let's give a press conference, please, to the thing, keep them on side. The police won't do this because they just don't. The Spanish, Portuguese, I've worked with them all. They do not talk to the press. They do not talk to the press.
They keep things close to the chest.
I just don't talk to the press. With the exception of Portuguese police with Madeleine McCann, because the day after the Gonzalo Abral and his team, I don't know who it was, were leaking incorrect information to the press on the very basis to try and push the British media away and criticise the British media. It all went completely wrong. But anyway, going back to Jay Slater, so I said to the family, listen, just give a press conference. Anyway, they were all up for it. They said, yeah, really good idea, everyone's on board. And then Debbie, at the last minute, said, I can't do it. I just want to do it. I don't want to upset the police. And I said, you've got to do it. I said, there's a press conference being called. I said, what are you going to say? And they said, we can't do it. And I said, well, listen, I'll go and do it. So that might be the one. So I'd stand in front of 30, 40 journalists from around the world.
And it was worldwide. Listen, let's be honest. It was.
Stood in front of them, 30, 40 people, telling them the story in terms of...
But you know what, Mark? I remember being over there. And I remember it was a Sunday night, he went early, I was on to the Monday morning. And I remember sitting on the pool and it was like, it was on social media, this lad's got this. And then all the conspiracy theories, done this, he was up to no good and all that. And he's an 18-year-old lad who's gone on holiday, and like many young lads, silly things as you do as a kid growing up, and it's life lessons that you know what I mean and stuff. But I remember seeing his mum when his family had gone over, and his mum was obviously like any mother would be distraught, and
devastated.
She was. I just seen her with the press, and she was like, she got ripped to, that was like, you could see.
It's really tough. It's really
it was
tough
like
as a person. If I said to you, if your family went missing today, and the press was suddenly on your doorstep interviewing and talking to you, you'd buckle. You'd struggle.
Of course you would.
You'd really struggle. It's really tough. I mean, I'm used to it now. I've fronted everything, but it's really tough. You've got to choose your words really carefully. You've got to say the right things, and she did. I'm still in contact with her.
Do you still speak to them?
Yeah. I spoke to Mum. Probably Debbie. I spoke to, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and I said to her, listen, I'm always here. And actually, that for all of my cases, even ones that happened years and years ago, for all of my cases, I keep that door open so that anybody that
can reach out.
I remember dealing with a job years ago where the young boy goes missing, and I did it as a program, and we couldn't find him. And I said, look, I'm sure he's alive. And the police had said, no, definitely dead. And I said to the family, look, I'm pretty sure he's still alive. Years later, I get this phone call out of the blue from Mum saying, Mark, could you help us? And I went, well, what's wrong? She said, we kept your number and we just hope you can help. I said, what's the matter? She said, well, we've been told that I can't remember his name, is in he's in Spain, he's in a mental hospital. They won't tell us where. And they found him, and he's had a breakdown, and basically, so he'd been missing for, I don't know, 15 years or something. And I remember saying to her, and she said, what can you do to help? I said, well, let me have a think about it. And I said, will you go with this? She, well, what do you reckon? I said, let's go big on publicity. Let's promote this, and let's embarrass the hospital to tell us where he is on the basis that he can't make an informed decision, and you as a parent can do to help him. Anyway, we went really big on it, and it resulted in the family getting a phone call from the doctor in charge of the hospital, to the consultant, to say he's in this hospital. So I said to family, listen, why don't I come over with you? And I did it with this morning, and I said, listen, I'll come over with you and let's see if we can talk to him and see what we can do. And we get over there, and we're sat in this room with the consultant, Mum, Dad, me, and the consultant says to the family said, oh, look, we bought some clothes for him, we bought this, we don't expect to take him back straight away. And the consultant said, it was really sad, the consultant said, he don't want to see you. He don't want to see you. And I remember, and they said, but they don't want to see you. So I said to them, so we walked outside, and I said to the family, listen, go with this. How about I say to consultant, I'm an old family friend, and I know him, because that'll get me to talk to him, and maybe I can then say to him, you're here and everything like that. I said, will you go with that? And they said, well, anything that might get you to talk to him. So we went back into the consultant, and we said, and I said, listen, can I talk to him? I said, I'm an old family friend, and the consultant said, yeah, that's okay. Yeah, if he'll see you, no problem. So they go in, he comes back out, and he says, yeah, he'll see you. So I walk in there with the bag of clothes, And I said to him, listen, you don't know me. I'm being straight with you. You don't know me. I'm a friend of the family. I said, I work in television. I'm a friend of the family. They care about you. They don't want to take you away. And I can't remember what I said to him, but he listened to me, and he was listening to me, and I said to him, would you just see them? Would you just see them? Literally, all they want to do, they won't say anything. They just want to give you a bag, and they just want to give you a photograph of your brother's child that's now been born. And he said, yeah. And so I got the family in, and he stood there, and he took the bag from them, and he took she gave him because she said, this is of your brother's daughter, and you could just see his face. He looked at this picture. I can see it now. He looked at this picture, and he just, for a moment, he was there. He kind of he was back in the room, and he took the bag, and he said, have you got any money I can have? And the mum gave him some money, and he took the money. Anyway, cut a long story short, they then worked with the hospital. There was a dialogue that started, and 3 months later, they flew him home, and he came and lived back. He came and lived at a hospital near to the family, and I remember the year he came back, that Christmas. I remember the family phoning me up. I think they phoned me up about 3 or 4 days after Christmas and said, Mark, we've had the most amazing Christmas. He came and spent 2 hours with us, and we thought we'd lost him. And it was a really, it makes me well up talking about it.
I can see it in your eyes. I can see it.
Such an amazing thing. But to be involved to help the family to do that. And I remember thinking that, just having that ability to open those doors for them, to allow that to happen. And it was it was brilliant that he was back in.
It's cases like that, though, Mark, where you've not given up. And obviously, I'm not going to dwell on all going back to Jay Slater and stuff like that, but because it was so recent. But look, with what's been said and how he lost his life, and 29 days later, I think it was, he was found. What failings was, your honest opinion with the police and stuff?
Well, I think it's really it's a very treacherous ground around there, so it's really hard. And I think it would be.
Do you think it's what happened to him there? What people were saying? That's actually what happened.
Yeah, I mean, he fell, he died. Yeah, end of. I mean, no one pushed him. There wasn't anybody else up there. His body wasn't. He wasn't killed somewhere else, and his body dumped there. I don't know what other stories there are, but the reality.
There's many out there, Mark, isn't there? But
I mean, no aliens come along and picked him up and put him down there, and he fell. He fell. The proximity to where his body was found, it ties in totally with the last pings on his phone, and corresponds completely with the way that his body and the injuries on his body that were found. Everything ties up. For anybody to come along and say, but there's foul play, there's this and this, is because they haven't listened, or they haven't taken into consideration what the scene is telling you. And actually, I've been there. Okay, I didn't go to the location where his body was found, but I've seen pictures of it, and I've had it talked through. I've talked through real detail with Debbie. When I went out there and we started to, I said within the 3 days I will be able to tell you whether this is a third party involvement or whether it's. And within 3 days I did. People have said to me, yeah, but you haven't. No, I did. Within 3 days I said that I believe that there is no third party involvement. I said, I'm still open to the option that that's possible. And of course you would always be. We're going to investigate a case. You're never going to close that door because something might suddenly come in. But I can tell you all the evidence telling me at the moment is that there is no third party involvement.
A lot of people, like the internet detectives, that's what people call them. Watch, he was up to no good. He was doing this.
But I spoke to every witness out there.
But like they were saying, like the Rolex watch and all this, and and he was up to no good. He was doing this. He was grafting and stuff like that.
He was a young lad. He was a young lad who went on holiday and did what many young lads do when they go. I mean, listen, you got young kids. Don't send them to Tenerife.
Yeah, I like many places, you know what I mean? I love going to Tenerife, if I'm honest.
I'll tell you what, that strip there...
No, that strip's a bit naughty, like, but, I mean,
we got I got out of a taxi, and there was a police officer stood kind of where your wall was, and these 3 people came up and offered me drugs, literally, as I got out of this taxi.
I think of it, you stay away from the strip, you know what I mean? It's one of those where it used to be But Tenerife, I love the place, but
Yeah, I mean, I've just dissed the whole of Tenerife.
No,
That's
you
not
haven't. No,
true.
you haven't. It's just it's a strip, Veronica's. It is. I think it is.
It's Veronica's Strip. Don't go to. If you've got young kids, do not let them go to Veronica's Strip. And you know, it's a crime haven. But Tenerife is beautiful.
Plenty of lovely places in Tenerife. You know what I mean? So obviously, getting on, Mark. These are a couple of questions. These are a few questions from our. This is from Joe Parkinson. This is a lad I know from the football. Tony, would you ask Mark, do you think he jumps on the back end of cases, yes or no?
No, I don't think. What I do is I identify where people. This is how I would say.
Yeah.
I identify where people need help. So you can see a situation where a family are desperate for help, and I'm kind of poacher turned gamekeeper. I've been a police officer. I'm now an investigative reporter. I know exactly how to make it work and help people. And I think actually, if you look at any of the cases I've dealt with, I've always helped them.
Yeah.
You know, I've always got to a position where I've been able to give them some help. I mean, you know, I still talk to Debbie. You know, if I jumped on the back of a bandwagon and they weren't happy, you know, we've had some strong words. We have, because actually, you know, she's
still speaking to her now. Like
still speaking to her. You know, we've got this professional relationship between the two of us in terms of how, you know, I've been, and the thing is with certainly with Debbie's case, with Jay's case, is I found stuff out which probably parents wouldn't want to know, but I've told them, and I say that with everybody. Every major investigation I've ever done, I will always say to the family, I just need to tell you, be prepared that I will find stuff out that you probably don't want to know.
You want to know the truth, and I'll find.
But I will tell you. But it's not so much the truth. It's about everybody has things in their life that probably they don't want other people to know. There are things that are embarrassing. There are things that they've done that they probably aren't very proud of. That's part of life. That's part of growing up. But you probably wouldn't want your parents to know that. And so when you find stuff out and you then in a position to say, well, actually, do you know what, they did this or they did that. And the thing is, it's really important when you're dealing with a major investigation like that to be honest and truthful. This is where they got it wrong in the bully story, because actually what they should have done is been really honest and truthful right from the very beginning and say, yeah, you know, there was a mental health issues. Because if they'd have done that, it wouldn't have become a massive story, but the police covered that up. I believe that honesty and transparency
the best policy,
is absolutely vital. So when you talk to a family and you say, look, I found this out, just be honest and straight. So in answer to Joe's, I don't believe that. Now listen, people are entitled to their opinions, but I do it genuinely because I care and because I want to help people. And I don't like to see people suffer. No,
that's brilliant. I can say that to him when I go to football next week. He answered your question for you, Joe. But Mark, what are the biggest challenges investigating historical abuse cases?
The biggest challenges? Well, probably because there is never anybody else in the room. You know, I think if you talk about sexual abuse cases, then it's one word against the other. They're very rarely, if it's historical, so non-recent, there's no evidence. You know, it's not as though you've got forensic fibres or you've got videos, you've got something else. So 99% of the time, it's your word against them. And of course, that's very difficult because there's always this power imbalance, particularly if they've got a position of trust. So yeah, very, very difficult to make those. That's why as an investigator, it's really important for us to build the other supporting evidence around, whether that be that they've told somebody at the time, or whether that be there's another victim, because what we know with offenders is they don't offend in isolation. There will be multiple other victims. You know, when we investigated Savile, I said quite early on, there's probably about 500 victims. I remember sitting in a room with the head of Operation Nutri, and he said to me, we're probably about 30 to 40 victims. And at that stage, obviously, we were right at the end of our investigation. The program had gone out. And I said to him, 500, and actually I was proved to be right. 6 months later, the report the Metropolitan Police did said there were 500 victims, so I was spot on. But yeah, I think historic cases are really difficult to investigate because, of course, they're not in the current time. That you're having to get information from people historically that it's having to tell you something that's not here and now. And of course, everyone's memory changes, doesn't it?
Of course it does. Also, what are the key differences between police investigations to journalism investigations?
Well, they have a power. I don't have a power. So they can go and nick people. They can force people to
no more anyway.
To give information. So we have to use different techniques to enable people to talk to us. But very often they'll talk to us because perhaps also they might hate the police and they might feel that actually, do you know what? I'm being given a voice. I think it's about I think the skills of being a journalist is very much about communication. It's about talking to people, it's about listening to people, it's about people giving people a voice. And I think as a society, we have one of the best press in the world. There's no doubt about that. And I've covered stories around the world, and we have the most impartial and the best press. There's no doubt about that. But the reality is, of course, is that sometimes the press get it wrong. The police get it wrong, and I think it's really important that we as journalists hold authorities to account. I think it's right for us that we hold the police to account, we hold authorities to account. But we don't ultimately. I can't go and nick somebody. I can't go and bang on their door and search their house. So I have to use other persuasive ways to do it in order to get evidence from people. And it is a challenge, of course it is. Our biggest, and of course the other biggest thing is that the police service exists because the public consent, allow it to happen. Policing is by consent in this country. There's no doubt about it. Journalism, journalism's so important because I think as we have to hold everybody to account, whether that be public, whether that be the authorities to account, but there's less and less resources and less finances being put to proper investigative journalism. Now, sadly, journalism is very often about sitting behind a computer and using the internet to try and find stories. That's not what journalism is about from my point of view. So when I do my journalism, I do it as a police officer, or my skills I learned as a police officer.
What's your take on why some offenders manage to avoid detection for so long?
Well, many different reasons, isn't it? I mean, sometimes they avoid capture because they've been very lucky and they haven't left any forensic trails. It happened a long time ago, so forensics are very different to today. The incompetence of the police, they've been lucky. I don't believe that criminals, I believe criminals have a lot of luck, but I think we as a society, and I always think to myself is that, if you've got away with a crime, I hope one day you'll get caught. And we have to have confidence that even those cases I dealt with where the killer's still at large, we have to have confidence that one day they'll get caught. And if they don't get caught, I hope that they spend every single minute after that in hell. Because, if you've taken somebody else's life, in the fashion that they have in the cases that I investigate, I want you to be really unhappy. I want you to live, because I've seen the pain that families go through when they lose a loved one, whether that be a loved one that they know the answer to, i.e. they've got a body to bury, or they've got a loved one that they don't know the answers to. And in fact, those are the cases that are even worse, because when you've got somebody, when you've lost a loved one who's been murdered, and you've got the body, you can bury and you can deal with that in a way. You're never gonna forget it, but you can deal with it. But it's the not knowing. When you lose a loved one and they've been murdered, but you haven't got a body, you just never know the answers. You never know, and you can't say goodbye to them. And actually, for those are the ones that it is the hardest. And people often say, "Oh, it gets better over time." It doesn't. No. I can tell you as someone who's worked with so many victims of loved ones who've been murdered, is that actually it gets harder, and it gets harder if you haven't found the body, because in the early days the police are there, the press are there, everyone's there, and then you're on your own, and actually you like, who's there to help me?
Is there one case, Mark, that you feel particularly frustrated about to the lack of justice? Is there one case?
Yeah, the current one. I'm determined. Determined to nail this one, because actually it's a case that could be solved if the police didn't have such arrogance.
Really?
Yeah.
And this is one that you just really want.
Yeah. Someone come along.
Someone give us this back and this.
Let's do it. I mean, it frustrates me so much, because the thing is that as a family, if somebody says something to you as a family and they admit to the murder of your child, you want that tested, don't you? You want that evidence tested.
Yeah.
So if I said to you, okay, your relative is buried 150 yards from here, you can't go and search the area, but you can tell the police, and the police can. And the police say to you, we don't believe them, we're not going to do it. And you're going, hang a minute.
They're not going to pursue it.
Hang a minute, but but what if they are in there? I'm sorry, we're not going to do it because we don't believe them. And you're like, oh, hang a minute, but I can't do it. You're the police. Why won't you go and search it? So that for me is like, you know, if I was in the police and they'd have come to me, I'd have made it happen. And that's why I'm trying now to make it happen. And I won't give up. We will get there at some stage.
Well, hopefully sooner than later, sort of thing. Mark, you're up for 2 awards, I do believe. On-screen, outstanding documentary, on-screen impact for change. Is that, you know?
So we did that. It's a miscarriage of justice case. It's a dad and a son who were convicted of murder of the dad's brother, and we've shown evidence that categorically it wasn't them. And actually, we've tracked down a key witness who's identified who the murderer is, because there was a conversation that took place on the day of the murder, on night of the murder, immediately after the murder, where 3 people were told that actually the killer is this individual. That individual has now died. We've named that individual. Unfortunately, we haven't got a position whereby obviously they can be brought to justice, but we have put together a file for the criminal case review, and it's with the criminal case review now. And we're hoping they will make a decision where they will ask for the case to go back and to be listened to. The reality of that's probably incredibly slim because getting cases overturned and reheard in a society where it's difficult enough to get a case before the court in the first place, because there's no court time, is really, and percentages of overturned miscarriages of justice is just non-heard of. It's like when we did the Jesse Earl. You know, probably 1 in 2 years is there an appeal for a coroner's inquest. They just don't happen. So, but we've given the evidence to the criminal case review. We are confident that we have now identified the right man, and and hopefully we'll win. But we'll win on the basis that hopefully that will then tell the family, you know, that they were absolutely right to support, you know, their loved ones, and they never did it. But it was a strange thing, because in the day, the police is very different today now, because in those days, if the police officer said something in the 70s and 80s, it was fact.
Yeah.
So even if it wasn't fact and you kind of made it up and it wasn't really true, the courts would still believe you. Evidence is tested much differently now.
Absolutely balmy, Mark. It's crazy that, you know, obviously, like you say, you know, police officers in the 70s, I'm not saying it was their say, but now there's so much evidence and stuff.
And rightly so, you know, because actually courts have to be fair and have to be seen to be doing the right thing, and they have to be doing the right thing. You know, it's people's lives and I think we do have the best criminal justice system in the world.
Just before we go, family life today, you've come up with your partner.
My lovely lady.
Yeah, so, you know, how's family life today? Is it
it's good, really good. You know, I'm in a really, really good place. I've had some difficult times. You know, I've been very open about my mental health. I had a breakdown. But I'm now in a position where, you know, I've met someone who's kind of given me that missing piece in my life, which I don't necessarily think you know you've got a missing piece in your life. You get on with life and you see what it is. But actually, you know, I've now realised I've got someone in my life who feels everything, and I'm very happy. I'm the happiest I have ever been. Yeah, really am. And I'm mature. Of course I am. You learn, don't you? You learn a lot of things. But I'm very happy, and I'm looking forward to. We've got some exciting plans.
I follow you on your socials, and then I see you and I'm looking out and about, and that's good to see.
We love it, and I'm looking forward to, you know, tomorrow, a month's time, a year's time. I think it's really exciting, and I think that's
plans and stuff.
Yeah, loads of plans, and I you know, I love planning things,
traveling and stuff like that.
Yeah, I love traveling.
We all
love traveling. I love, you know, the plans of things, and I think we all you will go through different stages in our lives, don't we? And I think, you know, some people meet the right people, some people don't. And I think sometimes you have to meet perhaps the wrong people to meet the right people.
Yeah.
And but I think, you know, I have not been as happy as I am now. And I think it's about being on the same planet and being in the same, you know, same understanding, caring. And I think I'm very happy.
No, that's good to hear. And Mark, you know, speaking about, you know, the adversity, you know, you had the breakdown and stuff, being so open about that, because that goes on a lot of men and women out there, you know, who don't recover, and, you know, it's good to see that you're so open about that.
I was close to not being here anymore, and I think and I would urge anybody you know, man, woman, and I know it affects obviously men, mental health, you know, much more than women.
They don't speak out and stuff.
No, you know, and of course the suicide rates in males is far greater than in women. But I think one of the realities is that I think I would urge anybody that's suffering, you know, to speak out. But that's not an easy thing to say, because actually when you're in that zone, you don't want to. What I would urge people who are friends of those people is make that extra call, go and see them. You know, if they say to you, I'm really suffering, then listen, that's fine. But then a day later or 2 days later or a week later, go and see them. Just turn up, or make that opportunity to go and see them, because actually deep down they do want you, but they'll push you away. And you know, and I think as friends we have to look out for our other friends. And I think it's very easy. We're all so busy. It's very easy to step away and go, do you know what, actually they don't want me. So, but I make that effort. And I know certainly 2 of my friends, they stayed with me during that time and were really helpful. And actually I pushed them away a lot, but they didn't go, and they kept coming back. Yeah. And they'd leave it for, you know, a week or a month, and then they'd phone me up and say, oh, you know, we'll come and see you or do that. And they actually tended to do it together. I don't know if that was a supporting thing between the 2 of them. But I just, you know, mental health is something that is obviously big on the agenda. But I do think for those people that are suffering, whether it's situational depression or whether it's, you know, it's hereditary depression, but I do think we need to look after each other more. And I think just be kinder. You know, this society is so angry and so unforgiving and so judgmental, and just care about people a little bit more, can we?
That totally bang on, Mark. It's absolutely spot on exactly what you're saying, because in today's society, like you say, a lot of people, you don't have to be cool in the gang. Everyone's different. You know, if you're happy, and you know, a lot of people, I think, like a lot of things on social media, people pleasing and stuff like that, and people just let people be nice. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say it. Do you know what I mean?
And I'll tell you the other thing is just social media can be so poisonous. And I would say to those people who are the influencers, those people out there, just think about what you're saying. When you're covering a case, just think about the impact of if the family are listening to this. You know, Jay Slater, classic example. I used to say to Mum, just don't read the media. Even when I say it now, she says, oh, you know, occasionally I do, because I just, you know, I end up down this little rabbit hole. But just, if you're out there making comment on it, just think, you know, is that what I'm saying? What would the family think if they listened to that? Just be a little bit more considerate and care. You know, if you wouldn't say it to your own kid, if you wouldn't say it to your own family, then please don't say it to other people. Exactly. Just care about people a little bit more. And if we cared a little bit more about each other, I tell you what, would be a much happier society. The world would be a better place. What's in the pipeline for Mark Williams-Thomas? So, well, obviously this programme that we hopefully will get commissioned, and I've got a couple of other potentially big things bubbling of other things. Obviously Jay Slater, I think we're in the process, hopefully, of getting that off the ground as a podcast. And I mean, lots of fun things. I dig around and do things all the time, and development. Obviously, we're developing a property together, and you're spending time with my lovely partner and family. Yeah, she's got a lovely family. I've got a lovely family. So I think, and we've got 2 dogs as well. So you know, lots of walking and stuff like that. Loads of walking with the dogs, who are like having children sometimes. Yeah, tell me about it. You know, but Mark, listen, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.